if I say achieved, I don't mean just, records of any sort, but there is a social conscience that's at work. He's currently director of the Edmund Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University and professor at Harvard Law School. He started out at the Wharton School of Business and subsequently earned an MA in philosophy from the University of Cambridge and a JD from Yale Law School. And interestingly enough, he clerked for Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeal, and then, yes, for Justin Antonin Scalia at the Supreme Court.
Wow.
Yes. And I think that's just amazing. He has taught at the University of Chicago Law School and later Stanford Law School before he came back to Harvard, where he also had taught. So there has been a change of consciousness at some point. And we consider Larry Lessig today as someone very progressive, and he has indeed been fighting for many important causes. With his background, he could have had any position in a high-tone law firm and could have made a lot of money, but maybe I can put it this way, he chose the road less traveled. After fighting for a more liberal policy for the use of copyrights and software, which cost him several lawsuits and a withdrawal by YouTube, at least for a temporary moment, of one of his TED Talks, of which there are quite a few. Professor Lessig has, in recent years, focused on the fight against government corruption, and particularly big money in elections. His books on that subject are Republic, Lost, How Money Corrupts Congress, and we got 25 copies over there for sale if you're interested in buying one. And then he has come out with another book that is titled One Way Forward, The Outsider's Guide to Fixing the Republic. I could go on for a long time, but let's hear what he has to tell us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Larry Lessig.
So thank you. I'm going to try to speak up so people can hear me because there's feedback with the mic up here. So can people hear me? Yeah. I guess that means you can hear me. Yes, great. I'm incredibly honored to be here tonight to begin this conversation here at a place that honors Granny D. Granny D was a guest blogger on my blog long before I started thinking about the issues that I'm going to talk about tonight. And she was an inspiration to me and, of course, to many others. And the conversation we need to have as a country is one which she began us on many years ago. And it's about time that we bring the country to the place she wanted us to be. And we have not much more time before this country finally confronts the questions which she put before us. But I want to start tonight by focusing first on something all of you know, and then bring you to what I think we need to believe. So let's start with what we know. There are a lot of people around this room who focus on something they call campaign finance. And they are campaign finance reformers. I look at those words and they just feel too big to me. Too big, too sterile, a way to think about this problem, kind of like talking about an alcoholic as if he's a person who has a liquid intake problem. So I want to think about this in a less sterile way, a little bit more accurate way. What I think we need to talk about is corruption. Corruption. The problem we face is that our government is corrupt. But the key here is to identify how it is they are corrupt. So let's think a little bit about how this government is corrupt. I want to tell you a story. All stories begin something like this. Once upon a time. So once upon a time there was a place called Lesterland. Now, this is a secret. Please don't tell anybody. My first name is actually Lester, so I'm allowed to make fun of Lester. So here I'm going to make fun of Lester's here a little bit. There's a place called Lesterland. Lesterland looked a lot like the United States. Like the United States, it has about 311 million people. And like the United States, about 144,000 of those people are named Lester. I know this because the internet told me, so it must be true, but there it is. 144,000 are named Lester, which means about 0.05% of Lesterland is comprised of people who are named Lester. Now, Lesters in Lesterland have a very interesting power. Every election cycle in Lesterland, there are two elections. One election we call the general election, and the other election we call the Lester election. In the general election, it's the citizens who get to vote, if you're over 18, in some states if you have an ID. In the Lester election, it's the Lesters who get to vote. But here's the trick. To be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. Okay, so what can we say about democracy in Lesterland? Well, number one, we can say, like the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, the people of Lesterland have the ultimate influence over elected officials, because after all, there is a general election. But only after the Lesters have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, and obviously, this dependence upon the Lesters is going to produce a subtle, understated, maybe camouflaged bending to keep those Lesters happy. So, it's a democracy in Lesterland, but a democracy dependent upon the Lesters and dependent upon the people. These are competing dependencies, maybe conflicting dependencies, depending upon who these Lesters are. Okay, that's Lesterland. Now, there are three things I want you to recognize now that I've described Lesterland. Number one, the United States is Lesterland. The United States is Lesterland. The United States also looks like this, also has two elections. One election we call the general election. The second election we should call the money election. In the general election, it's the citizens who get to vote if you're over 18, in some states if you have an ID. In the money election, it's the funders of the campaigns who get to vote. And as in Lesterland, to be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the money election. You don't necessarily have to win. There is Jerry Brown, but you must do extremely well. So what can we say here? Well, the key is to link USA to Lesterland. There are just as few relevant funders of campaigns in USA land as there are Lesters in Lesterland. And you say, really? Really? 0.05%? Well, here are the numbers from 2010. In 2010, 0.26% of America. I know you're thinking he's a lawyer, doesn't know how to do numbers, but I really mean 1/4% of America gave $200 or more to any congressional candidate. 0.05% of America gave the maximum amount to any congressional candidates. 0.01% gave $10,000 or more to any collection of congressional candidates. And my favorite statistic from the last presidential election, 0.00042% of America For those of you doing the numbers, you know that's 132 Americans gave 60% of the super PAC money spent in that presidential election.
Wow.
So, as a humble lawyer looking at the range of 0.26 to 0.05 to 0.01%, I think it's fair to me to say, at most, 0.05% of America are the relevant funders of campaigns. In this sense, our funders are our Lesters. Now, what can you say then about democracy in USA land? Well, number one, the Supreme Court was completely right. The people have the ultimate influence over elected officials because there is a general election. But only after the funders of campaigns have had their ways with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle, understated, maybe camouflaged or not so camouflaged bending to keep those funders happy. Members of Congress and candidates of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And the thing we have to think about is, what does it do to them? As they spend their time dialing for dollars, calling people they've never met, asking for the money they need to run their campaigns. At Harvard, B.F. Skinner invented something called the Skinner box, where these animals learn which buttons they need to peck to get their food. We need to recognize these are the candidates for Congress. What they learn is which buttons they have to push to get fed from their campaigns. This is the funders box. It is the way we produce members of Congress. And as they live that life, as any of us would, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Lessig, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, "He was not an environmentalist." Okay, so here too, in America, we have a democracy, but as in Lesterland, one with two dependencies, one upon the funders and dependency upon the people, competing dependency, conflicting dependency, depending upon who the funders are. Okay, the United States is Lesterland, point number one. Here's point number two. The United States is worse than Lesterland. Worse than Lesterland. Because in Lesterland, you can imagine if we Lesters get a letter from the government that says, you get to pick who the candidates will be that get to run in all their campaigns, you can imagine it's possible at least a certain aristocracy of Lesters would develop. Right? There are Lesters from every social class. There are black Lesters, there are white Lesters, not many women Lesters, but put that to the side for a second. There are Lesters from everywhere. It's at least possible that these Lesters would begin to act for the good of Lesterland, thinking of themselves as serving this higher purpose. But in our land, in this land, in USA land, though there are some sweet Lesters out there, the vast majority who participate in this way of funding campaign act for the Lesters. The shifting coalitions of funders that comprise the 0.05% are not getting together to advance the public interest. They're getting together to advance the private interest, their private interest, depending upon whatever issue is on the horizon, whether it's climate change or financial reform or healthcare legislation. The United States, in this sense, is worse than Lesterland. But then point number three, the key I said at the beginning to how we should understand what it is about this democracy that is corrupt. Lesterland is, or should be understood to be, in our tradition, corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean cash secreted in brown paper bags to members of Congress. I'm not talking about bribery. I'm not talking about Rob Blagojevich sense of corruption. I'm not talking about any criminal act. Indeed, everything I'm describing here is perfectly legal. Indeed, according to the Supreme Court, constitutionally protected. Nothing I'm describing here violates any legal or ethical code. But it is still a corruption relative to the democracy, to the republic the framers of our Constitution imagined they were giving us. The framers gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 describes it, a government that would have a branch that would be dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model of government. We have the people, and we have the government. I did my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? So
Yeah.
and the government. An exclusive dependency. But here's the problem. Our Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not an exclusive dependency upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders too. This is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. And the funders are not the people. The funders are the tiniest slice of the 1% of us. They are not representative in any sense of the people. This is a corruption. And in this sense, our government is corrupt. Now, you can look at it and you say there's pluses and minuses to this corruption. The good news about this corruption is that it's bipartisan. It blocks the left on issues that we on the left care about, from climate change to healthcare policy to food safety to financial reform. But the critical thing is it also blocks the right. It makes it harder for people on the right to get the kind of reform that they want to. So for example, people on the right say they want a smaller government. But what people on the right need to recognize is that the way our current system of funding campaigns makes it almost impossible to imagine producing a smaller government. Al Gore, when he was vice president, had an idea for deregulating a significant chunk of telecommunications regulation, of the telecommunications industry. And his chief staffer took that idea to Capitol Hill. And as the staffer reported it back to me, when he took it to Capitol Hill, the response from Capitol Hill was, hell no! If we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them?
Oh.
So what people on the right need to recognize is regulation is a pretty effective tool to extort or coerce campaign contributions.
Yeah.
So if you want to imagine shrinking the size of government, given the way we fund campaigns today, you've got a thumb on the scale against you and make it almost certain that you can't achieve your objective. So the point is, this is a system designed to save the status quo, and it works against the reforms that both the left and the right would advance. That's the good news. It's bipartisan. But here's the bad news. It is a pathological, democracy-destroying kind of corruption. Because in any system where such a tiny proportion of the country exercises such extraordinary control over policy, what that means is that the tiniest fraction of that tiny slice, the tiniest fraction of this tiny slice, has the capacity to block reform. Literally, tens of thousands of Americans. Regardless of the issue, it takes just tens of thousands of Americans to band together and raise the money to block Congress from any of the reforms that Congress must adopt. And that's because at the center of the economy, which is in DC, there is this entity called the lobbyists who channel the money through the system, fed by those who would block reform, to fund the campaigns of the candidates who live in the funders box, so dependent upon raising the money to get back to Washington. This is a system that feeds on polarization. It feeds on dysfunction, because polarization and dysfunction paradoxically make it easier to raise money. And the critical point to recognize is that nothing will change in this system ever until we change this system. Whatever your issue is, if it's global warming, or it's healthcare, or it's financial reform, or it's labor issues, or whatever your issue is, the critical thing to recognize is we will have no sensible reform about your issue or your issue or my issue until we change the system. Now, that's what we know. But here's what I think we need to believe. We need to believe something about what we can do about this problem. And I want you to think about two things that we need to believe. Number one, this problem can be fixed. Number two, and crucially, New Hampshire is the key to fixing it. Okay, number one, it can be fixed. Because if you think about the problem the way I've just described it, the analytics for fixing it are pretty easy. If the problem of our government is they're spending too much time fundraising from too small a slice of America, then the solution is we find a way to give them less time to fundraise. But if they're fundraising, they fundraise from a wider swath of America. To spread out the funder influence to the ideal of Madison, that it be all of us who are participating in funding so that they are dependent upon all of us, meaning the people alone. And to do this would require one statute in the statute books. A statute that would establish what people talk about as small dollar funded campaigns, meaning campaigns where people are contributing small amounts of money or have vouchers for small contributions and use that to fund campaigns, and the government makes it so those contributions are effective enough to make it that candidates can run winning campaigns with small contributions only. So for example, in my book I describe something I call the Grant and Franklin Project. The Grant and Franklin Project would say every voter would get a $50 voucher, a voucher that they could give to any candidate who agrees to fund his or her campaign with vouchers only, plus contributions of up to $100, so $50 Grant, $100 Franklin. The vouchers alone in that system would be $7 billion, which is 3 times the total amount raised and spent in 2012 in congressional elections. So it's real money, but it comes from all of us, not from the tiniest slice of the 1%. So it spreads out the funder influence and addresses the thing that I'm describing as the core of this corruption. It's easily fixed through a statute like this to address this core corruption. Our current system is one where the top 1% of Americans have 10 times the per capita influence in corruption as the bottom 99% combined. So the analytics here are not hard. It's the politics that's hard. It's the politics that may be impossibly hard. Because the reform that I'm describing, the reform that many in this room have been fighting for, is a reform that would shrink the power of K Street. K Street, where the lobbyists work. And K Street, of course, has begun to define what Washington means. As Jim Cooper, a Democrat from Tennessee who's been in Congress since the mid-1980s, told me, Washington has become a kind of farm league for K Street. Farm league for K Street. And what he means is that members and staffers and bureaucrats in Washington have an increasingly common business model in the back of their head. A business model that's focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. So 50% of the Senate, public citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, left the Senate to become lobbyists. 42% of the House. And as United Republic calculated last April, for the members that they tracked who left to become lobbyists, their average salary increase was 1,452%. So in a world where everyone inside the Beltway depends upon this system surviving, it's a fair question to ask, how is it possible to imagine them changing this? Now, I've spent the last 6 years going around the country trying to explain to people how it's possible. And the truth is, I've never been fully convinced of my own explanation. Because it's quite possibly not. But the more I think about this problem, the more I've recognized that if it's possible, its possibility starts here. And this is why. The The answer to this problem has got to be New Hampshire, and that's because of a simple, obvious fact. Even though it would astonish the framers of our Constitution, they would be appalled with this fact. The fact is today that presidents lead. It is only presidents who lead in major policy reform. And it is the fact that New Hampshire leads presidents. So what those two facts together mean is if we're going to end this corruption, then we need a president to lead to end this corruption. We need a president who's going to take this issue up as the issue. And what that means is that if we're going to have a president who leads on this issue, then New Hampshire must lead the president to this issue. Must lead the candidate to this issue. Now, it's my view that has to happen in exactly 872 days from today. 872 days from today, on January 26, 2016, the current day as planned, it must be the case that corruption in the sense that I'm talking about it is the #1 issue that people in this state are talking about. The #1 issue that candidates running in this state need to address. So how can we make that so? And the simple answer is, as the 400 people who will be running for president in 2016 pump this state full of dollars in hotel bills and things like that, as they go around and speak to you 1,000 times per citizen of the state of New Hampshire, you need to ask them. You need to ask these presidential wannabes one question: how will you end this corruption? How will you end this corruption? At every single event that Republicans and Democrats speak at, there needs to be this one question asked: how will you end this corruption? Now the fact is, they will not want to say anything about this issue. The most surprising and underreported fact about 2012 is that in July of 2012, Gallup did a poll they conduct every 4 years, asking Americans what are the top issues the next president needs to address. And #2 on that list was reducing corruption in the federal government. Now, by corruption, Americans were not thinking about Rob Blagojevich or Jack Abramoff. Those issues were years before. The corruption in July 2012 that Americans were thinking about was the corruption of the Citizens United money that was everywhere and reported again and again. What Americans were saying is, this system stinks. This is the corruption of our system, and this is the second most important issue to Americans to address. 87% of people identified this as one of the top issues. But if you turn to the presidential campaigns and see what they said about this, the #2 issue to Americans, they said nothing. Absolutely nothing. Neither Obama nor Romney's website even mentions the issue. And indeed, it is the only issue on the top 10 that was not even mentioned by either candidate. And I had a researcher look at this, to go back as far as we could see, to see what other issues over the past presidential elections were in the top 10 but not mentioned by either candidate. And it is the first time in as long as we can see when an issue was in the top 10, according to we the people, but completely invisible according to the candidates. The first time. So this is the sense in which we the people have now turned in one direction, and they, the government, the candidates, have turned in another direction, and this is exactly why they won't want to talk about this issue. So if we sit there silently, quietly, passively, politely, in the audience as they give you their talks about how they're going to produce jobs, or how they're going to deal with the deficit, or how they're going to address the tax problem or financial reform, if you sit there passively and let them go on and on and on, this will never be mentioned. And if this is never mentioned, this country will never recover from its corruption. The only people who can change the dynamic are you. You, candidates, address it. So they won't talk about it. We must, or you must. You must, if I can borrow a word my mother, who comes from the South, liked to use a lot, rebel against. You need to foment what we could think of as a rebellion against this way of ignoring this, the most important issue facing our democracy. We can rebel against them by saying we, the people, will not talk about the issues they want to talk about until they address the number one issue that we should be caring about. This number one issue, this question of how will you end this corruption, the rebellion. So imagine something that began to be understood as the New Hampshire Rebellion.
Yay! Woo!
The New Hampshire Rebellion. A rebellion inspired by an extraordinary tries to do two things over the course of the next 2 years. One thing it does is to sponsor many talks like this, where we invite a wide range of people who care about this issue as passionately as Granny D did and as many of the people in this audience did. Wide range from people like Bill Bradley to the opposite of Bill Bradley, Jack Abramoff, to Jason Alexander, who showed up in my office and said, this is the most important issue, what can I do about this issue? To, okay, he's a Vermonter, but Ben Cohen also has been fighting. So just think about the range of 100 people who we know are compelling and care about this issue, and imagine them spreading out all across New Hampshire, talking to people in New Hampshire and saying to people in New Hampshire, we need you, we need you. We need New Hampshireites to do one thing, to ask every candidate, how will you end this corruption? So that over the next 2 years, we train the people of the state to focus on this issue. Not because most people care deeply about this abstract issue of corruption, but because we get people to recognize that it's only if we address this abstract issue of corruption that we can address the most crucial issues this nation must solve. So always, every time one of them speaks, there is one question they have to address, and that is the essence of what could be the New Hampshire Rebellion, and magically, there are buttons. Hashtag NHR. It must start, this rebellion. It must start. And it will only start in a place like this. Ben Franklin, when he was carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, was stopped in the streets of Philadelphia by a woman who said, Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought? And Franklin said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic. A representative democracy. A government dependent upon the people alone. There is no doubt we have lost that republic. Inexcusably, outrageously, tragically, unjustly, we have lost that republic. And all of us must work, must find a way to get it back. And it may be that a rebellion here would get it back. It's that hope that I beg you to believe. Thank you very much. Corrections
think we actually have a right to rebel in New Hampshire under the New Hampshire Constitution?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Here it is.
The second question is, do corporations have belly buttons?
So our corporations people, there's been an extraordinary amount of good that's been done for our movement by the mistakes of the Supreme Court. Citizens United was the biggest gift we had ever received. Because Citizens United inspired literally millions of people to come into this cause who otherwise would have ignored it. And so the focus that Citizens United gave people, the idea that corporations are persons, that they seem to have First Amendment rights stronger than the rights of individuals, is a focus that's built enormous power for our movement. But as you notice, what I said tonight had very little to do with Citizens United. Because the truth is, I believe that if we mobilized a progressive movement to overturn the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United and won, we would get nothing. We would be no better off than we are right now. Because the truth is, on January 20th, 2010, the day before Citizens United was decided, our democracy was already broken. That's what Granny D walked across the country to tell us. It was already broken. The Supreme Court may have shot the body, but the body was already cold. So what we need to do is to fight for the harder fight, the fundamental fight, to change the way we fund elections. Because even if corporations can't spend a dime, the 0.05% statistic I gave you, there isn't one corporate dollar in that contribution list. That is all individual contributions. So we still would have Lesterland even if there's no Citizens United. And so what we need to do is the harder job of convincing Americans that we have to change the way we fund elections. And if we changed it through bottom-up, small dollar contributions, that's the kind of remedy, as John Rao and his extraordinary group has been teaching us for a long time, that's exactly the kind of remedy that people from the right and the left should rally around. And that's the kind of solution I think we need to be pushing for, as much as I agree with you that the craziness the Supreme Court has given us needs to be fixed, too.
Well, it's still a problem because the individual limit is $2,300 contributions, but corporations and somehow or another CEOs of the corporations can get around that individual limit.
Yeah, so don't get me wrong. So what the Supreme Court has said is not that they can contribute more than $2,500, but that they can spend it independently. And I think it's a terrible decision. It's a terrible decision. And it, of course, created a very large amount of super PAC spending in the last election, but 2012 is going to seem tiny compared to 2016. So I'm not denying we need to address this problem. But there are two ways we can address this problem. Number one, the Supreme Court could fix it itself. Or number two, we could get a constitutional amendment to reverse it. Now, I actually think the Supreme Court will fix it itself. I actually think there's a narrow way in which the court can uphold the principle they talked about in Citizens United, but stop the supercourts. But even if you think I'm wrong, we will never have the votes in the United States Congress, 67 votes in the United States Senate, to pass a constitutional amendment to address Citizens United, so long as the Senate and the House is picked through Lesterland elections. We will never have that. So we have got to change the way we fund elections. Now, some of us are also working on another constitutional strategy. Jeff McLean back here and I have been working on thinking about the framers' other remedy for a corrupted Congress. You know, when they drafted the Constitution, Article 5 of the Constitution sets out how the Constitution gets amended. An original draft said you can amend the Constitution by Congress proposing an amendment and then the states pass it. And somebody said, what if Congress is itself the problem? Which led them to say, well, yeah, we need another way to amend the Constitution, because if Congress is the problem, we can't trust Congress to fix the problem. So they created a procedure by which the states could call on Congress to call an Article 5 convention, which has the power to propose amendments, which also have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So this is a way around Congress to fix the problem. And we're working on that solution too. We're working on building a movement for that too. So I'm a believer that we have to be able to walk and chew gum and tweet at the same time. We have to be able to do all of these things, and we have to push all of these things. But what I want us to recognize is the really hard work that we will have to do is the work of convincing Americans we have to change the way we fund elections. Convince Americans of what we used to call public funding, but I don't think it's a useful way to talk about it. Citizen-funded elections is the only way we get our democracy back. That's the fight we have to win. Yeah.
I listened to your TED Talk about Lesterland, and at the end you mentioned 3 pieces of legislation in the Congress that would accomplish this small contribution. Could you tell us what those are?
Right. So in 2010, the House of Representatives, when it was still controlled by the Democrats, came very close to passing what was then called the Fair Elections Now Act. Now, the Fair Elections Now Act is a matching fund proposal, where you give a certain amount of money, it gets matched 5 to 1, 4 to 1, I can't remember. 5 to 1. So if you gave $100, government gave $500 for it, so it made small dollar contributions a bunch more valuable. But right now, the United States Congress, the Democrats in the United States Congress, are considering a proposal by Congressman John Sarbanes, who is the son of Paul Sarbanes, who gave us a statute not many people like, but he was a great senator nonetheless. Sarbanes' proposal includes something like vouchers or a pilot program for vouchers. It includes tax credits. It includes some matching fund proposals. So it's a mix of ideas that I believe the Democratic Party is going to line up behind as the reform proposal that they're going to be pushing. There's also something called the Americans Anti-Corruption Act. So if you go to anticorruptionact.org, you can find a statute which has small dollar funding, basically a $100 voucher, plus a whole bunch of reforms to make sure that we can control lobbyists and that kind of revolving door and corruption inside of Washington. All of those reforms were written by Jack Abramoff. They basically said to him, okay, how would the system have to be written so you couldn't do what you used to do? He sort of did the playbook for what would have destroyed his business, and that's part of the American Anti-Corruption Act. But that statute is the most ambitious reform proposal we've seen in 120 years in the United States. And then the additional proposal that I talked about in the TED Talk is the one I mentioned tonight, which is just the simple $50 voucher idea. But all of these are ways to spread out funder influence through a bottom-up system. The government isn't deciding who gets to spend what. Citizens are deciding who gets to spend what. But you basically make it so we're open about the fact that there are 2 elections, the money election and the voting election. We just make sure that everybody participates in both elections in the same way.
Would that be mandatory? I mean, how do you...
Okay, so according to the United States Supreme Court, you can't force candidates to adopt the small dollar system. But what we've seen in states that have done it in a smart way is if your numbers are right, they voluntarily opt into it. So when Connecticut adopted its small dollar funded system, where you basically got a whole bunch of signatures around a certain amount of small dollar contribution, and then you qualified for public funding, 78% of the elected representatives opted into that system in the first year, voluntarily opted into it in the first year. And that's because their campaign manager said, look, it's much better for us to be out there raising votes than out there raising money. We win by getting votes. So if we can get the money through this system and then go out and persuade people to vote for us, we're more likely to win. So they got the numbers right, and they got everybody to participate voluntarily. Maine's had a similar high participation rate, and Arizona is now experimenting with vouchers to add into their system to drive up the participation rate. So get the numbers right, and you get people to opt in. But again, I'm not defending the Supreme Court. Given what the Supreme Court has said, unless we amend the Constitution, we can't force them to do it. But I think we need to take what we can get, and we can get a lot just by a smartly structured voluntary system.
Perhaps a broad-based campaign of contribution could be folded into tax reform, which seems to be gathering some bipartisan momentum now. Do you have any comments on that?
I think the critical
Could you
strategy.
repeat that?
So the question was, could campaign finance reform be bundled into tax reform? And the first part of the answer is to say, there is all the reason in the world to bring these two issues together, because the single most important reason why we have the crazy tax system we have is that it makes it easy for candidates to raise the money they need to fund their elections. There's a Wall Street Journal did a piece a couple years ago talking about the rise of what they called the temporary tax code. So there's all sorts of provisions in the tax code which expire after a certain period of time. So you get a certain tax break for certain kinds of equipment, it expires after a certain period of time. The journal was puzzled because the number of these provisions had gone up dramatically. And it turns out Ronald Reagan was the first to give us a temporary provision. The Research and Development Tax Credit, this was introduced in the 1981 Tax Reform Act. It was made temporary because the Democrats said it wasn't going to work and the Republicans said it would work. So they said, okay, let's just try it for a couple years. Then we'll ask the economists. The economists will tell us whether it worked or not. And if it worked, we'll make it permanent. If it didn't, we'll remove it. So they tried it. They asked the economists. Economists from both the left and the right said it's a brilliant idea. It produces a kind of investment that otherwise would not be produced. It definitely should be part of the tax code. But that research and development tax credit is to this day temporary. And why is it temporary? Because each time it's about to expire, congressmen and the lobbyists call up the people who benefit from it and say, geez, we got a big fight here to continue the research and development tax credit. We're going to need to get the people we need in Washington to support it, so it's a moment to fundraise. And so as the Institute for Innovation Policy, which is a right-wing think tank about tax policy, put it, this is a device used by members of Congress to fund their campaigns. They structure the tax code to make it easier not to raise money for the US Treasury, to make it easier to raise money for the campaign treasury. So absolutely, it's a brilliant insight to link these two, because conservatives, in particular, who care about, are so anxious about, or so motivated to think about how to reform the tax code, can begin to see why the tax code explains the craziness in the way we fund elections. And the second reason it's a brilliant thing to do is that we need a way to bring conservatives into this conversation. You know, it is just not the case that we can win this fight with liberals alone. It's not clear liberals can win any fight, but just the numbers. We can't win this if it's thought of as a liberal issue. And it is not a liberal issue. It is an American issue. It is a corruption issue. It is fundamental to everybody, but we need to talk about it in a way that doesn't immediately make the right run away. And this is why you don't hear me, as much as I agree with the criticisms about corporations are not persons and about how money is not speech. I agree with all that as a beginning point. I don't think it's helpful to talk about this issue in that way, because when you do, 90% of conservatives immediately think you're Karl Marx and they want to have nothing more to do with you. So, tax reform is a perfect place to get people to see how this has to happen. It brings conservatives into the movement. I'd be all for finding a way to bundle these two things together. And so, yes, you're absolutely. There's a long way of saying yes. I could have just said yes. I say more than just yes. Okay.
Since we've never actually had a government dependent on the people, what do you imagine the 0.05% or the 1% or the Lesters would do in order to hang on to their corrupt power and privilege if this type of small money effort were, through our hard work and a certain amount of miracles,
so you're absolutely right. I mean, we had a democracy which at its birth only permitted white male property owners to vote. Okay, but at the birth of our nation, not everybody was white, obviously. And I don't think everybody was male either. So there's huge chunks of America that were taken out. But it's hard for us to recognize this. Most Americans were property owners. Most white males were property owners. So the original system actually embraced a huge chunk of the white male property class. And then the fight from that period on was about expanding the range of people who could vote. So the Jacksonians made it so the property requirement wasn't a part of it anymore. The Civil War made it so black males could vote. And then, of course, the suffragette movement made it so women could be part of that voting, and the Civil Rights Acts and the final amendment for the poll tax made it so regardless of your wealth you could vote. So we expanded that through history to make it so everybody could vote. That expansion, as hard as it was, is easier than the fight we will have to expand the range of funders.
Wow.
That expansion didn't take on the most powerful group in the world united behind defending themselves against the reform. This campaign will take on all the money in the world to fight for reform. And this is why I am not a believer in a slow movement for reform. There's some people who think, okay, we've got a 20-year campaign ahead of us. And I think if we take this issue on as a 20-year campaign, we give the other side 20 years to organize against us. And they can organize better than we can. They have more resources to organize better than we can. The only thing we can do to win this, I think, is to fight hard and quick right now. And I think 2016 is the year. Because if we don't change the presumption about how campaigns get funded after 2016, super PAC funding of elections will become the new normal. If you think about it, we have only ever seen fundamental change in policy when there has been a change in the way elections get funded. So Ronald Reagan was president because of public funding of elections. He benefited more than any other American from public funding of elections. He ran 3 times a national campaign on the public's dime. And if there had not been public funding of elections, there is no way the Republican Party ever would have heard of Ronald Reagan, because from the perspective of 1976, he was a crazy right-winger. I mean, if only for Ronald Reagan today. But the point is, he was a crazy right-winger, so the Republicans' money was not going to go to that guy. But public funding did go to that guy, and he became the candidate of the Republicans. Barack Obama wins because he takes a new technology for funding elections. And he completely surprises Hillary Clinton in the way this kind of funding can defeat the old style of funding. And so this is the new opportunity for victory. 2016 is going to be the super PAC method for funding elections. The super PAC elections. And unless we find a way to dislodge that normal, I don't know what 2020 looks like or 2024 looks like. I don't even know how we have the conversation then. So I think we have to figure out what the very fast, very powerful, very well-organized campaign over the next 2 to 3 years looks like if we're going to have a chance to win this. And so this is again why I come here to say you are the key. And it's not so hard to imagine organizing this state to make this the issue. It's not so hard. This is a manageable state. I couldn't walk across the country, but I could walk across New Hampshire. It's only 1.3 million, right, people here, and it's a long time. It's a long period of time, and you are very focused on political issues. It's possible, and if you do it, it could be effective, I think.
It occurs to me that 3 things have to fall in place, and I'd love your comments. For this to work, we have to remove partisanship from this issue. So where are the proselytizers from the right, and can we fill a room like this with conservatives? What's your experience? 2, we have to embrace the politics of New Hampshire, which means town meeting in 2014, and bringing this home. 3, looking for surprise partners. Goodness knows that the election finance system in New Hampshire is not enforceable. I know it's not. I haven't been caught, let's put it that way. But it has to be local as well. So how do we combine a local element to this? Where are the proselytizers on the right? Can we fill a room with conservatives?
Well, so I've made it my objective in everything I write about this issue and when I talk about this issue to talk about it in a way that people on the right can at least hear me. And the best reviews of my book were from people on the right. I remember the American Spectator review, I picked it up and it started with, Lessig thinks he's talking to people on the right. I cringed. But the very next paragraph began with, and he's right. And it went on for paragraph after paragraph about how the issue I'm talking about is exactly the issue people on the right care about too. Now, people on the right might not want climate change legislation or affordable health care. That might not be the issue they care about. But the point is they can see why crony capitalism is a corruption not just of government but of capitalism, and they're against it for that reason. So I do think there's a way of talking about this in a way that gathers people on the right. The organization which I helped found, Root Strikers, which takes its inspiration from Henry David Thoreau. I found this quote just before you had me come talk at the Democratic Party picnic. Henry David Thoreau, who wrote, "For every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root." So the one is the Granny D, or the root here is the money. So Root Strikers is about multiplying the number of people who are striking at the roots. At our Root Strikers conference in San Francisco, the chief ethics officer for George Bush, a guy named Richard Painter, came to speak. He was an amazingly powerful speaker. He supports vouchers. He supports a $200 voucher every American gets. His justification for it is the current system is a system of taxation without representation. Because the only people who are represented in Washington are the Lesters, or the people who can afford the lobbyists who back up the Lesters. And so he says, this is a system where I'm not represented, and I shouldn't pay any taxes into the system until I'm represented, and I will only be represented if everybody had a voucher that made it so they could control their elections. This will resonate with the right if we approach them with integrity and with honesty and openness and say to them, look, we don't have to agree on every issue. We just have to agree on this issue. And if you think about times when this has happened before, World War II had a bunch of allies who were not all the same. Right? So Stalin and FDR and Churchill sitting in the same room was not a group of guys who had all hung out for their whole life and had the same view of the world. Right? These were radically different people, but they put their differences aside to focus on a common problem. And even at our founding, people look back at the founding and they say, how diverse were those guys? White male property owners, basically the elite of America sitting together and writing the Constitution. But there was profound differences in that group. There were people who believed in slavery and people who believed slavery was the moral abomination of the age. But they could put that difference aside to save the country because they recognized the country was about to collapse. Right? So we have done that before, and that's exactly the frame we have to do now. Now, your other two issues are New Hampshire issues, right? So this has got to be a New Hampshire movement. Like, who am I? I mean, I love New Hampshire. My family and I have come to Squam every moment we can, but this has got to be a New Hampshire movement. And we're actually talking to people in New Hampshire about how we put it together. And Jeff, why don't you, we're going to have an event to kind of launch the idea in, the date is the 25th, is that?
23rd, October 23rd.
October 23rd in
Manchester at the Sheen Finney Law Offices.
Yeah, so if you go to this place, New Hampshire Rebellion on Facebook, you can learn about it. But the objective of that event will be to say to people in New Hampshire, what can we do so that New Hampshire owns this project? And the warrants at the town meeting would be extraordinarily important, of course. And finding out how to make this issue local is also important. But that's the work that people in New Hampshire have to do. Yeah, we have two at that table. Why don't we start with the red shirt and then the blue shirt, just to be bipartisan about this. Yes,
Yes, as a community organizer, I see three things we have to do simultaneously. We have to get the money out of elections, we have to change the way the large majority of people don't participate at all, and we have to change the way people get their information. Because as you know, the mass media controls people's minds, and 90% of the mass media is controlled by 6 Lesters. So I think if we were to use this issue as an organizing tool and also focus on the 2014 legislative elections, congressional elections, if everybody in this room committed to doing door-to-door canvassing, telephoning, tabling, we could organize citizen action groups in every town in the state that can meet in their town, give each other honest information, and then connect with this issue. I think in the next 12 months we can greatly change, the whole political scene on this issue and lead that into the 2016 elections.
I certainly hope you're right, because if you don't,
Organizing is the key.
if you don't, we can't, as a country, solve it. Yeah, I'm sure.
So I'm one of a number of state legislators in the room, and I'm really glad to say I'm not the only one here. Congrats to my fellow House members for caring about this. I'm actually introducing a bill next Tuesday to call for an Article 5 convention. Do you have any advice on how I can explain this issue to fellow legislators who do not have a very good grasp on constitutional minutia? And the second I mention the topic, they panic and think that we're going to see, a personhood amendment on the table, a balanced budget amendment on the table, and a laundry list of other things that would never actually get ratified by the states.
Yeah, so this is a big issue, a big topic. So I'm not going to be able to address everything about it. But here's the first part. The framers of our Constitution imagined you to be the ultimate defender of our Constitution. Because what they imagined is, if the Constitution was threatened by a corrupted Congress, it would be you, the state legislator, who would take up the responsibility to fix whatever was corrupted inside our government. So I, number one, believe you have the responsibility to do exactly what you're doing, and I thank you for doing what you're doing. This is the one thing that people on the far right and the far left agree on, that an Article 5 convention is a terrible idea. Phyllis Schlafly, or the Birch Society, the John Birch Society, has, for 50 years had a view that there were two things that were going to bring Stalinism to America. Number one is fluoride in the water, and number two is the Article 5 convention. Well, they might be right about fluoride, I don't know. But the Article 5 convention one is just crazy talk, because all an Article 5 convention can do is to propose amendments. And the only way an amendment becomes part of the Constitution is if 3/4 of the states adopt it. Now, 3/4 of the states is a large number, because there is a very large number of states that are basically
27 double red, 17 double blue.
Okay, 27 states have Republican control of both houses, and 17 have Democratic control of both houses.
5.
So that means that there is no amendment that could ever pass that would have a substantial opposition from either party, because either party could block it just by getting 13 states not to pass the amendment. So there is no chance, in my view, politically no chance, that any crazy amendment becomes part of our Constitution. But to be honest, one has to admit there's a risk. There's a risk. So let's put that risk on this side of the table, and then look at the risk on the other side of the table if we do nothing.
Yeah.
Because I don't think there's a risk there. I think there's a certainty. The certainty is our government cannot function. Our government cannot address every important issue our government needs to address. And so there is a risk, but I think it's worth the risk if this is a path to getting us a government that can actually solve the problem. Now, historically, it's a pretty good precedent for the role of conventions. As Jeff reminded me in a nice retort, the standard complaint about the Article 5 Convention is the Bill of Rights will be erased. But as Jeff said, of course, it was the threat of a convention that forced the framers of our Constitution to give us the Bill of Rights. Because after the Constitution was proposed, a whole bunch of states said, well, there's no Bill of Rights here. We're going to have another convention after the Constitution was ratified. They said, okay, fine, we'll send out a Bill of Rights. So it gave us the Bill of Rights, number one. Number two, the last time we came really close was exactly 100 years ago. The United States Senate was still appointed by the state legislatures. And most in the progressive movement believed that was a source of the corruption in the United States Senate. People thought only rich people would become senators, and they would buy their seats. Turns out, That's still the case, but okay. But their idea was we have to find a way to make senators directly elected. So they said, amend the Constitution. And Congress laughed and laughed and laughed. And so then they started an Article 5 convention movement. And they came within one state of having enough votes to force Congress to call a convention. And they terrified Washington. Because Washington was like, oh my God, if there was a convention, what will they propose? It could be a disaster. So they quickly sent out the amendment that everybody was calling for to cut off the movement for an Article 5 convention. So I believe even if we don't get to an Article 5 convention, this movement is the sort of movement that will force Washington to do something in conjunction with everything else everybody else is doing. So I applaud what you're doing. I thank you for what you're doing. And if I can help in any way, I'd be more than honored to come with you.
Our founding fathers didn't put the parties into the Constitution, but they did put in a method of nominating papers and getting the necessary number of papers in order to get onto the general election ballot. And in the last election, after having served as both a Democrat and a Republican in the New Hampshire House, I decided to run as an independent and get those nominating papers. It was a very educational experience for me, and I did reasonably well doing it because my name was known, which is a real problem. But the thing that impressed me the most is you have to do it ahead of time. And if you could tie public financing to that kind of a system and not let people get on to the general ballot unless they get the necessary number of nominating papers and the money accompanies the nominating papers through some system of public financing. I think that's a system that's in place, that we don't have to go through all this problem of educating people. That's why we do it in our local community. So I think that that's not been explored sufficiently to tie those two things together. And I'm wondering why we couldn't do it and why we shouldn't do it.
So that's a great question. Our democracy faces...
Repeat it, please.
So the basic question was, first of all, identifying the problem with the two-party system, making it very hard for independents who are not part of both parties to participate in the election system. And the way in which they have to participate is actually changed. It's different state to state, but you participate through a process of nominating papers. And in some states, if you have run in one primary for one party, you're not permitted to run as an independent in the general election. So basically, it's a system designed to entrench the power of the two parties. And I think there are many people who say, rightly, that the entrenched two-party system is part of the problem with our democracy. And I would agree with that. And I think the gerrymandering system is part of the problem with our democracy. And I think we could go through a list, and in this room we could agree on 10 things that are the problem with our democracy. But my point is, what is the thing we have to solve first? Because, for example, if you solve the gerrymandering problem, and instead of 85% of the seats in the United States Congress being safe seats, 100% of the seats in the United States Congress were contested in each election, we'd have a lot of elections to fund, but if you fund them the way we fund them right now, with the Lesters funding those elections, the Lesters would have more power than they have right now. So unless we solve the funding problem, solving the gerrymandering problem won't get us anywhere. So I would join with you. We've got to solve the problem of blocking independents from participating in the system. But as you said, we have to tie that with changing the funding of the system. So bundle the two together, and I'd be happy with the result. But if you don't bundle the two together, then I'm not excited about that change on its own. So I think the two go together.
I would like to add that I discussed this with Granny D at great length. And we both agreed that without the tying the two together, it would never work.
Well, you didn't tell me Granny D thought this. I mean, it's
You didn't tell me Granny D thought this.
Do we have one more question before?
Yes.
Yeah.
you discussed this with former Senator Greg Gravel from Alaska? Because his idea is direct voting is the only way to fix it. He doesn't believe that we will actually be able to change that triangle that you show, money to lobbyists to congressmen.
Well, I haven't had the chance to talk to Mike Gravel, although he's been a very important voice of reform on a bunch of issues, and in this one too. I'm not a supporter of direct democracy. The reason I'm not is that in a system of direct democracy, it's actually easier for special interests to organize their power. Because most of us have lives. We have kids, we have jobs, we have hobbies. We don't have time to focus all our attention on the issues we need to be focused on in order to be informed about the wide range of issues government's got to address. So he might be right about how hard this problem is, but I don't think that means that the right answer is to move away from a proper representative system. No, but this begs the hardest part of this talk, and in my TED talk I talked about this, but since I'm back in New Hampshire where this event happened, let me just tell the story again. So when I spoke about this issue at Dartmouth, maybe that woman is here, a woman after I spoke stood up and said, "Okay, Professor, you've convinced me. It's completely hopeless, and there's nothing we can do." Nothing that can be done. And the truth is, when I think about this issue, when you line up the interests and the power that's at stake, that's a pretty fair estimate. But when she said this to me at Dartmouth, I was kind of panicked. I needed a response. I needed a way to deny the pessimism. And I haven't had a chance to talk to my shrink about this yet, but what came to my mind when she said this was a picture of my then 6-year-old son. And I imagined a doctor saying to me, "Your son has terminal brain cancer, and there's nothing you can do about it." So, would I do nothing? Just accept this? And of course, the recognition is, obviously not. You would do everything you possibly could. Because that's what love means. Love means the odds are irrelevant. The odds are irrelevant. You do whatever you can out of love. And then the next step was to recognize that even we liberals love our country. And so when the political scientists or the politicians with experience say, it's impossible, there's no way you can win this, my answer is that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. I know we have to win this fight. We have to win this fight. And so because we have to win this fight, the fact that we can't doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. We're going to work as hard as we possibly can to win this fight because we must. So,
have us be responsible for the New Hampshire Rebellion. I'm both terrified about let's do it.
In terms of organizing, do we have a massive email list from this meeting that could be shared with everybody?
Yes.
We do, yes. We'd
Okay.
be happy to do that.
All right.
And also, Jeff was reminding me that if you Google New Hampshire Rebellion.
Yeah, the Facebook page literally just went up, so actually if you go to the search bar, just type in NH Rebellion, all one word, you'll find it. But literally, it was just born about 30 minutes ago. You're all part of the rebellion.
So it takes more than 30 minutes to build a web page. So, but Jeff will have a web page on this.
And we'd like to just maybe end Bob Perry, who's a state legislator and our board, give us an update on our bills. We do have a public, citizen-funded, small donation bill before in study at the New Hampshire House, which is frankly not doing well.
Speak up.
We have a call it actually a Granny D bill, but it's again a system similar to Maine, in Connecticut, as I was saying, that matches to take the citizen-funded route. What you do is you have to get a certain large number of small. Thank you, Olivia. You get a small number, you get a large number of small donations. Those are then matched, and then in the general, you actually get a block grant, so you can actually go out and campaign instead of spending all your time. And it's very interesting. A lot of another piece of good news is a lot of our New Hampshire politicians do not like this spending 30 to 70%, even especially in the Senate, raising money. They would actually like to actually legislate and to do stuff. So I mean, we have that slight advantage going for us. But Bob will give us an update on, we have disclosure bills and this small donation citizen-funded bill before the House right now. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to be a little, I've been asked to reduce my presentation from an hour and a half to 4 minutes. Please, thank you all for coming, and please don't leave here without our contact information. That is the Coalition for Open Democracy. Pick up information at the table. It will have our contact information on it. And of course, make sure that you stay in contact with road strikers as well. Very briefly, we have two bills coming up for a subcommittee meeting next Wednesday. One is a small donation funded election bill, quite consistent with what Professor Lessig was talking about. Again, it's a subcommittee meeting. Maine has had a successful program for 11 years. We're not building a new wheel here. Arizona has a program as well as Connecticut. Rob Werner, who is here tonight, as well with those other programs as well. The other bill is a disclosure bill. That is a bill that would require special interest organizations to register with the state and disclose their expenditures. So the candidates and the public would have some idea of where that money is coming from and who the target is. And that's only fair. Last time I knew, and this is an old figure, unions were outspent 10 to 1. So I get a little bit angry, I guess, when I hear about union spending. The money that is spent by unions is different as well. It comes right out of the pocket of the working American, whereas corporate spending comes, well, we supply the money that they use against us with every purchase from their company. Okay, so next Wednesday, room 307, I believe it starts at 10 o'clock, those two bills. I am prime sponsor on the disclosure bill, co-sponsor on the funding bill. Representative French, who is staring at me right now, hoping I don't mention her name, is prime sponsor on the public funding bill. I guess I can do two things at once, even if I'm a guy. All right, I'm doing it. Look at that. In closing, COD is working for disclosure and citizen-funded elections. Thank you for your support. You have time and talent. Please stay with us, stay connected to this organization. As the professor so clearly indicated, this is fundamental. What we're doing is fundamental to democracy, representative democracy. Please call either organization to volunteer, to donate. If you buy the book up there at the end of the table, you will have the appropriate contact information that I would want you to leave here with tonight. And please provide this message to family and friends about the importance of what we're doing. We have one part-time staffer here for the Coalition for Open Democracy. She's standing back at the wall.
job. She's very committed to the cause. We're very fortunate to have her with us. I would like to bring, lastly, I'd like to bring your attention to a debate that's coming up on the topic as well, September 12th. Money in Politics, Corporate Power in American Democracy, the call for a 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a debate between John Bonifaz and Representative John Hunt. That is going to be September 12th, 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. At the University of New Hampshire School of Law. That's the Redmond Center School of Law, 2 White Street in Concord. That is going to be a very interesting debate. I don't know who challenged who. I don't know anything about it really, other than it exists. I will certainly be there, and you're welcome to come. And again, I believe I used up my 4 minutes, and our greatest thanks to Professor Lessig.